Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. And my guest today has got some big ideas. Chris Daw is a high-profile barrister. He was made a QC several years ago, and he's just written an extraordinary book called Justice on Trial, which has the sort of the subheading of Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point, but essentially is an argument about why everything to do with our justice system is wrong and needs to be scrapped. Chris, welcome to Ways to Change the World. We normally build up to a final question on this podcast, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and change the world, how would you do it? But I think we should do things the other way around on this episode, because you've got such a sort of a clear programme of things you want to do. I think we should get you to tell us what it is and then unpack it. So, starting with, the arguments in the book, how do you want to change the world?
Well, what I want to do is completely change the way that we think about crime and punishment and criminal justice, because for many, many years, and in the book I go right back to the beginning of time and the very first justice systems and back in the Mayan civilizations and Greek and Roman times, and bring it right through to the present day. But right the way through criminal justice is this kind of like a stick of rock, is this idea of a binary choice between good and bad people. And bad people need to be locked away, they need to be punished, they need to be treated harshly. And the entire ethos of the book is, let's stop thinking like that. Let's stop dividing society into good and bad people, and let's look at what actually works to reduce crime on the streets, to reduce the harm, for example, of the use of and the supply of drugs, and let's stop poisoning many, many young people in particular by making them part of the criminal justice system from as young as 10 years old, and basically condemning them to a life of misery in and out of prison. And sadly, of course, the impact on society as well, the fact that those young people often end up committing so many crimes and spending so many years in prison at vast expense. So the entire ethos of the book is basically, let's just rip up the rule book and start again with a blank sheet of paper and see what actually works.
And this is not based on you being some sort of do-gooding social campaigner. This is based on your work as a barrister in court.
It is in part based on my 26 years of criminal practice at the bar, and as you say, defending in some of the really kind of big, serious and nasty cases. I've appeared in murder trials, I've appeared in large drugs conspiracy trials, I've acted for people in rape cases and other sort of serious sexual violence cases. But I also spent a great deal of time researching the book all over the world, in the States, in Europe, and just taking a step back so that I could try and see the wood for the trees. So I spent at least 2 years, and in part of that time, as you may know, I filmed a documentary series for the BBC about crime and punishment, and spent a great deal of time in prisons and with all sorts of people, victims of murder, for example, or the families of murder victims, including young knife crime victims. And I tried to bring it all together in the book and say, okay, where are we going completely wrong? And how can we do something radically different, which will achieve very specific aims, reducing crime? And so it's nothing to do with the do-gooding kind of be soft on criminals approach. It's about reducing crime and there being fewer victims of crime, which is the most important function of a criminal justice system. And that's what I'm arguing is we're doing very badly. We're sending people to prison, we're criminalising drug users, we're criminalising kids, and all of that means more crime. So it's the product of 26 years of day-to-day criminal practice and a vast amount of research, travel and reflection along the way as well.
Are you now a disillusioned barrister?
I think I'm disillusioned with the fact that my job as a defence lawyer in the current criminal justice system in England, I believe is largely a waste of time. I think most of what the criminal justice process does all day, every day, is a total waste of time, and worse, it actually makes crime worse. It makes the sum of human misery greater. And so I am disillusioned with the whole system. We, on the inside of the system, those of us who work in it, we do our best. We do our job within the parameters of what's possible and what's lawful. But ultimately, I feel that day after day, we're just making things worse. When we see young kids being arrested and criminalised on the streets of London and other cities and all over the place, and then they just get into this sausage factory, this kind of revolving door of in and out of the justice process, in and out of prison, on and off of drugs, and the whole thing, for me, is a source of great disappointment and disillusion. And we need to make a change. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse. The prison population will continue to go up. Doubled in a generation, it will double in the next generation if we don't do something soon. And that is a mark of failure, not a mark of success.
I mean, in a way, we shouldn't be surprised, should we? Because our whole approach to justice through the ages has been, not very sophisticated. We used to just kill people, and then we used to put them through absurd, trials of torture and burning, and then we decided to lock them up. So it's never really been an enlightened approach.
No, not in England, it hasn't. I tell some of the stories in the book of the sort of really appalling things that happened in the past. For example, I relate in the book one of the sort of mass hangings that took place in the Victorian era of young children. I think one as young as 8 who was hanged for theft. And you just think to yourself, that's just part of the infrastructure, or rather the DNA, if you like, of the system we still have, because we still treat children appallingly. We don't hang them at the age of 8 anymore, but we lock teenagers up in conditions where they're infinitely more likely to self-harm and kill themselves, or indeed get murdered, than kids on the outside. So we're still treating, our most vulnerable people. I mean, one of the most important statistics for me in the book is that you are 15 times more likely to be in prison if you've been in the care system. It's hardly surprising that they become embroiled in crime and criminality. And when they do, whose fault is that? We were the ones as a society who were in charge of those children in our care. And we made them 15 times more likely to go to prison. And we need to look at it that way, rather than, as it were, putting them on the front page as some sort of pariah, these terrible tearaway young criminals all stabbing each other. They were children, many of them still are, and we need to start thinking about it in a much more caring and a much more productive and pragmatic way.
We do have to think about people and what human nature is, don't we? I mean, and what we think is the purpose of justice. For you, having worked in this for a quarter of a century, is the purpose of justice to reduce crime, or is it punishment?
Well, for me, any rational system of justice should have as its primary objective to make people's lives better. And by that, I mean not just the criminals, or as we often just refer to them dismissively, but more importantly, in many ways, the whole of society. So from my point of view, the justice system's principal objective should be to reduce the level of crime, in particular to reduce the amount of violent crime and crime that causes the most misery and distress to members of the public. And on that count, if you take that as your objective, we are dismally failing. We have always dismally failed. And we need to just start thinking about it. How do we achieve that objective? And everything else really that you do in the system should be targeting the reduction of crime, rather than this sort of reflexive emotional reaction that you need to get tough or you need to crack down. Crackdowns, whatever that means in terms of enforcement or in terms of harsher prison sentences, all that ever does is make the long-term problem worse. And so what's happening is that the medicine that society has chosen to use for crime over the years has been tough punishment, has been prison, has been, many people argue for harsher and harsher prison conditions. The medicine is killing the patient, because our society is not improved in terms of that main objective of becoming more safe for people to live in by that particular form of justice.
So give us some examples of where you see things going wrong.
Well, the worst thing for me that's happened in criminal justice over the past probably 100 years, but certainly over the past half century, has been the approach to drug prohibition and drug law enforcement on the streets. So up until round about the late 1960s, the UK was one of the leading countries in the world for what's called the British approach to drugs, which was the more addictive drugs, like heroin, for example, were available to users on prescription through doctors. There were a relatively small number of them, and there was really no black market for those drugs, or no significant black market for those drugs. And in the late 60s, the US led the way and bullied other countries to go along with them into bringing in the Misuse of Drugs Act in Britain, which came into force in 1971. And that Act of Parliament, for me, was the single most destructive act in criminal justice, because within a few years of the passing of that act, the number of problem heroin users went from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands. The numbers of deaths rose exponentially from overdose and from, gang activity, turf wars, shootings and stabbings. All of it traced directly to the prohibition of drugs. And we've learnt nothing from the experiment of prohibition of alcohol in the US, which had exactly the same effect. You went from a market that was lawful and licensed, and yes, there are health problems attached to alcohol. Of course, we need to deal with those. But you went from that to organised crime explosion, turf wars, violence, and of course people drinking moonshine and all sorts of other ridiculously strong alcohol that was killing them in a way that doesn't happen so much with the licensed product, which is quality controlled and strength controlled. So we basically made the same mistake as they made in the US with prohibition, and we did it in the early 70s, and we're paying the price for it now in the form of hundreds of thousands of addicts, massive amounts of drug-related crime, misery for drug users who are alienated and don't have access to counselling, treatment, or even basic sort of health services in many cases. And that, for me, is the number one fundamental mistake that we've made. And if you were to reverse that course and to move to a licensed drug supply network, you would see overnight, within 12 months or so, you would see a dramatic reduction in overdose deaths, in gang-related violence, and of course, to a large degree, if you did it that way, you would wipe out the organised crime networks, which are so deadly in inner city communities, but also increasingly via county lines in all communities. So these drug gangs, because they take advantage of prohibition, are spreading their tentacles all over the country. There are turf wars going on in small towns all over the place where you wouldn't dream there was a heroin problem, but there is, and it's a problem because we've left drugs in the hands of criminals. We take it out of their hands, we make society a much better and safer place.
How widespread in the criminal justice system do you think your views are? Are we now living in a world in which prosecutors, judges, defenders, and criminals all think this is mad? Or by and large think this system is mad and doesn't work, and yet are perpetuating it?
I'll tell you who doesn't think it's mad, and in terms of drug prohibition in particular, is drug dealers. Because the one group of people that are in favour of prohibition of drugs are drug dealers, because that's how they make their money. We've even seen in lockdown, during the last few months, that the drug supply chain was still continuing to function. It's market forces, and you were seeing more and more drug crime. Drug crime was up during lockdown. So drug dealers love prohibition. They love anything that restricts the supply chain because, of course, it increases the price because of supply and demand, and it increases, therefore, the profit that they can make from the same substance. So that's the one group that think the system's working great. So if you want drug dealers to be happy, leave it exactly as it is. And I've spoken to many, many drug dealers. Obviously, I've represented some of the largest importers of drugs into this country over the last two decades or so. And to a man and woman, in some cases, they've said to me, prohibition's great for us. The minute that changes, we've got no business left. And so it'd be a disaster. So it's worth thinking about that perspective. But all of the other stakeholders that you described, the judiciary, those of us who have kind of had significant experience of day-to-day criminal practice and criminal cases, I suspect of course there are mixed views, but I suspect that deep down, the great majority of those within the criminal justice system would accept that it's thoroughly dysfunctional in many respects. I'm not suggesting all of those in the system would go as far as I do, but it was very interesting. I mentioned this in the book. So when I travelled to the US last year for a research trip for the book, I interviewed a lot of judges, criminal appeal judges and elected criminal judges in the States. All of them refused to go on the record, so I didn't quote them by name in the book. But off the record, every single one of them, and this is in a country where they have 2.3 million people in prison, I would say to them, look, you've got the death penalty. You've got life without parole for 18-year-olds who have sold an ounce of weed. So they could be in prison for 80 years or 70 years for selling an ounce of weed. You've got this vast army of prisoners who are non-productive, living in violent conditions, who come out and just commit more crime. Why do you keep doing it? And every single one of those judges said to me, it's madness. Everything we're doing makes things worse. It increases the amount of street violence. It increases the amount of drug problems and overdose, which is on an epidemic scale in the States. So of course, logically, I asked the next question that you would ask, which is, well, why the hell are you doing it? Why do you perpetuate this system? And I remember one elected Court of Appeal criminal judge in Alabama said to me, if I said that we should stop sending drug dealers to prison, or God forbid that we might liberalise or even licence the supply of drugs, I'd be out of office in 5 minutes flat. No one would vote for me. And they're all elected judges, or many of them are elected judges in the US, or they're appointed by politicians who are elected. And so the dynamic, Krishnan, is that you've got this vast body of sort of public opinion, which has been influenced by the political process, which says, keep the sentences high, criminalise drugs, criminalise young offenders. And those in the system who are elected, if they don't spout that rhetoric, then they don't get elected. So anyone that comes to it with a sort of more pragmatic, reform-based approach, an evidence-based approach, they never get anywhere near the handles of power. So, and that's the same here. We had Boris Johnson prior to the last election, of course, Priti Patel saying, we need to build more prisons. We need to get, increased sentences. We've even had it recently, every time there is some sort of, public uproar about a particular kind of crime, the reflexive automatic response is, let's increase the sentences, let's make it tougher. And the public listen to that on the news, or they read it in their papers and they say, yeah, I agree, that's what we need to do. And you see it on social media. In my view, the great balance of opinion across social media is in favour of toughness, because toughness sells. It's a concept that's easy to describe. Crackdown, toughness, young hooligans. You use these sorts of phrases and the public emotionally and instinctively respond to it. If you say, hold on, let's think about the evidence and let's look at what works, for example, in Norway or Portugal, people switch off. It's not a message politically that people really can kind of get energised behind.
To come to the central and most controversial demand in your manifesto, which is basically to close prisons. You begin with a story, which I presume is sort of anonymised or sort of, a composite character of a guy who basically comes out of jail and commits a crime again, basically to get back in.
Absolutely.
Now, we've all seen movies along these lines, and whether it's Shawshank or whatever it might be, we're familiar with the idea of the institutionalized prisoner who basically is more comfortable in prison than outside. But do you think this is a sort of a common reality?
I'm absolutely sure it is, because I've been told it by prisoners as young as 19 and 20. So I've represented, in the past, 19, 20-year-olds and indeed slightly younger or slightly older who have got involved in really serious crime. Armed robbery with guns or serious drug dealing or firearms trafficking, really kind of serious crimes that get you very long sentences. And I remember having a client, I won't name him, but I had a client some years ago who had, by the age, I think I represented him for the last time when he was about 21. And the first time I represented him, he was 15 for armed robbery. And by the age of 21, he was completely institutionalized to the prison environment. He was completely comfortable there. He didn't have any fears of prison. He didn't have any concerns being there. He would have been frightened out of his wits to walk into a job centre and try and find a job. But the idea of being in prison with other people of his age, he was very well built because, they have gyms in prison and people work out and they have what they feel they need. And so I did talk about the character in the book I call Michael. Actually, the facts of the case are pretty much as they happen in real life. But you're right, I had to change the name. But Michael was a client who was a most unfortunate character. I mean, he did have some mental health problems and clearly had no kind of, a tragic kind of childhood history. But he'd spent 30 years of his 52 or so years lifetime in a custodial environment. And he never actually harmed anyone. He never actually assaulted anyone or damaged anyone in any physical way. It was crimes at all what most people would call fairly petty. But by the age of 52, the idea that someone who's been in prison for 30 years, he sat in the conference rooms with me, utterly at ease in a prison. That was, again, he would shiver at the idea of being on the other side of the wall. So what are we doing when people actually, even though prisons are not holiday camps, are this ridiculous nonsense that people spout about how they're holiday camps, they are really desperately miserable places, and they certainly would be to you and I, Krishnan, if we had to spend any time there. But people become so institutionalized in those environments that they are utterly afraid and incapable of functioning in the outside world.
But are you actually saying just stop sending people to prison and close prisons down?
Yes. So my argument is this. there's 69% of those who are in prison are in for non-violent crimes. So you know, the great majority are in for non-violent crimes. For my part, I don't see any value in sending non-violent offenders to a conventional prison environment, because what happens to them when you do is that they, in the end, either become more serious criminals or they become violent criminals, or both. And so it doesn't work. And what we now have the technology in terms of facial recognition, all sorts of electronic tools that to enforce home detention, not the old-fashioned electronic tags around the ankle, but there's a vast sort of panoply of technology, much of it from China, which allows you to monitor people very, very closely, whatever they do by you know, eye print recognition, fingerprints, all sorts of kind of technologies. So people like that, what you really should be doing with that 69% is that they should be, if they need to be detained at all, and many of them don't, they actually just need to have a bit of a jolt to the system, and then and ideally continue with a job, continue to look after their children, continue to pay rents and mortgages, which really at the moment we stop them doing completely by the way that we criminalise and lock them up. But we really need to use things like home detention enforced by technology. And you think about the cost savings of that. That 70% are no longer costing us £50,000 a year to house in prison, which is roughly the average in Britain. But they're costing us nothing to house because they're living in their own house. And also, ideally, in the majority of cases, you would make the conditions of their kind of electronic prison, if you like, you would make the conditions that they have to work or go to college or do some activities on the outside, which again could all be monitored. So you'd be the ideal scenario would be limiting the amount of physical restriction to that necessary to protect the public, and ensuring that those particular offenders are actually able to use their time productively, and therefore not have this huge shock to the system. The day after they walk out of prison, suddenly, you know, the sunlight in the eye, what the hell, I don't know what the world looks like, I don't know what to do. If you allow them to actually stay in home detention when they're not a risk of violence to people, then you'll get a continuity. Yes, they may have an infringement, they may have a brush with the criminal justice system, but ideally you will want to keep them working, you want to keep them productive, studying, whatever it might be.
Wouldn't you also have to rethink things like the Proceeds of Crime Act, though, and, you know, stop seizing assets and stop taking people's homes, because then you create other problems. And, you know, that has a problem in terms of, letting people get away with it.
The Proceeds of Crime Act, which came into force many years ago now, nearly 20 years ago, it's been utterly ineffective. All it has done, in the vast majority of cases, has just resulted in people spending more time in prison because they don't really have the assets, and the way the calculations are done are so artificial that you end up with people being given £1 million confiscation order. They haven't got £1 million. I had one client who had I think £1.5 million or 1.2 million confiscation order, didn't have it. It was all based on an artificial calculation to do with the Proceeds of Crime Act, and he spent an additional 7 years in prison in default of payment of a confiscation order that he was never going to be able to pay. And that's hanging over his head for the rest of his life. What's the point of it? It doesn't get you the £1 million, but you could say you're getting tough and you're seizing the proceeds of crime. So the proceeds of crime, it's a different argument. It's not strictly the same argument as prison, but the logic is the same. If you make orders that are impossible to enforce, all you do is set people up to fail. But one of the points I wanted to make, if you don't mind, is and perhaps you're going to come to it, but what about the other 31% who are in prison for violent crimes? So far as that group is concerned, the great majority of that 31% are relatively trivial acts of violence. You know, they're not, stabbing people or causing them breaking limbs or anything like that. They're relatively trivial, low-level assaults. I'm not minimising the impact of those crimes on victims. But once again, the great majority of even the 31% will be better dealt with in the community in a home detention setting, which may have strict or harsh conditions on what they are and aren't able to do, where they can and can't go. But they are still less likely to reoffend in that environment than they would be if they were in the prison environment and then came out of the prison environment. In my view, there's only possibly 10 to 15% of those who are in prison today and tonight and for the next week who are seriously violent people who cause an ongoing and direct risk to the public if they are out on the streets. And those people need to be securely detained, but they don't need to be locked up in Victorian prisons and become institutionalized and once again have their behaviours reinforced They need to live in a relatively normal environment, as they do, as I describe, a prison in Norway, which is, you know, a model of prison reform, where the conditions are as similar as possible to the outside world. And in Norway, they have that system. Criminals, and they're only the most serious criminals in Norway because they send so few people to prison. But criminals are even allowed to have their families to come and stay with them in a cottage in the prison if they earn the kind of the privilege and if they deem to be safe. And so they come out and their family network is still there. They still have contact with their kids, and they have skills, and they have life skills as well, and psychological help, which means that they only have a 20% recidivism rate in coming out of those prisons.
And would you apply that to everybody? Yeah. I mean, you know, would you say, you know, multiple murderers, rapists, child abusers, they should all be treated as if the end point is normal life?
Well, I would say that, because if you look at the stats, I say we've got over 80,000 people in prison. The current figure is give or take 62 out of 80-something thousand who will never be released. So, you know, the Lee Rigby killer and a few other of these really high-profile, shocking crimes, and people who are deemed never to be safe to be released. But it's less than 100, well under 100. And so the other 88,000 plus, 99.99%, will all end up back on the streets. Even those who have killed, even those who have maimed, even those who have raped, will end up back on the streets. And the question for me is not how do you punish them on the first day and throughout their sentence, but how do you make sure that on the first day of their release, they're not going to commit another crime, and that the public are going to be safe from them. And that's where the focus should be.
How do you answer people's desire for retribution, for punishment of serious criminals? You know, so many people out there, you know, when they talk about violent criminals, people who make, you know, us feel insecure in our homes, you know, that they should be punished. Maybe they should be locked up for longer. Maybe they should just be locked up for life. You know, there's a lot of people who think that.
There are, and that's the dynamic that we talked about earlier, that drives policy. So in the US, as I said, with 2.3 million in prison, that's the ultimate extrapolation of that emotional reaction that we need to punish, we need to get tough. They've done it in the US. They have the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. They have the largest prison population in the world. And if you walk the streets of Chicago, do you feel safe because of that? If you walk the streets of, you know, urban inner city environments, which have off the chart levels of drug crime, of shootings, of stabbings, and all manner of serious violence, that's the country that has the most people in prison. So if we want to go down that route, and many do, we can do that. But I'll tell you, the streets of London and the streets of Manchester will be much more dangerous places if we do that.
But then are you saying we actually need to remove the concept of punishment?
I don't agree with punishment per se, because punishment, as I deal with in the book, as I say, going back right the way to sort of Roman times and the sort of retribution that was the essence of many of the early justice systems. It's just that. It's a relic of our sort of emotional past. What it doesn't reflect is our ability in the 21st century to be rational and to use evidence to guide our decisions rather than the gut and the emotion. When you allow gut and emotion, we've got to punish. And I interviewed as I said to you, for my series, I interviewed the families of 2 victims of murder, each of them the victims of knife crime. And it was very interesting. So I sat down with one of those families, and they were arguing, so the killer of their son had been released on licence and had come out to kill within a short time of his release. And they were arguing they should be tougher, they should be getting longer and longer sentences. But even with them, and I was very careful how I put it as I sat in their dining room with a picture of their deceased son on the wall, and it's such a tragic, obviously a tragic kind of story. But I was able gently to say to them, but, you know, what you're arguing for is more and more prison. The man who killed your son had been in and out of prison since he was about 15, and he came out and killed your son. So isn't it possible to argue that rather than more prison, which arguably was, you know, part of the reason why he came out so violent, that if we'd have done something different with him when he was 12 or 13 or 14, rather than just this sausage factory of putting him through courts and so on, that maybe he wouldn't have killed your son. And they sat back for a minute and thought to themselves, you know, I hadn't thought about it that way. They just...
How do you answer the sort of the other riposte to that, which is, well, what about Singapore? What about Saudi Arabia? What about countries where punishment is so severe and so draconian that there does seem to be less crime and people feel more secure?
I don't think they do. I mean, Singapore is a slightly different example because it's a city-state. It's a very, very small geographical area. It's very heavily monitored by cameras. I mean, I was in Singapore recently. There's no comparison between the geographical and the economic societies that exist in Singapore and a sprawling country. I know we're not anywhere near as large as the States, but we're a large Western country with dozens of cities, big, motorways and easy routes in and out of everywhere. Singapore's a highly controlled environment, and it's a very wealthy city. It's one of the wealthiest places on earth. It doesn't have the same impacts and issues as we have in the UK. But if you talk about Saudi Arabia, of course, well, how do we know? Because they don't release crime statistics. They don't have any freedom of information. One of the very interesting statistics that I came across as I was researching the book was the sheer number of Saudi Arabian youths, young people, who take drugs in a society where you can be given the death penalty for taking drugs. And yet a significant percentage of young Saudi Arabians are taking drugs regularly, certainly smoking cannabis, taking other drugs. And so even there, that it doesn't work as a deterrent. But the fact is, let's be honest, does anybody who's British and believes in civil liberties, basic freedoms, treating people fairly and justly want to live in a country like Saudi Arabia, where the country is a dictatorship, where there are no human rights and where half the population, the female half, are treated with are given no rights at all, and where there's no due process for anything? I mean, if that's the example we want to live in, then so be it, but I don't want to live there.
And what do you say to all those people who'd go, well, Chris, you're not the first prison reformer who's come along and sort of suggested something radical. But the truth is, when it comes to designing systems, we're imperfect. We make a mess of things. Just look at what's going on with coronavirus or schools or any other aspect of public policy. We never quite get it right. And so you're describing a utopia that could never really be delivered.
Well, I think one of the points of the book was to take what I believe to be the ultimate destination of where we should get to and say that really this is where we should be aiming for. We should be aiming to have a much reduced prison population, not aiming to make it bigger. We should be aiming for drug supply to be a safer business for the consumer and for the rest of us. It should be a lower crime environment, and we should be aiming to wipe out organised crime supply chains. And we should be aiming to reduce to the absolute minimum the number of children who progress from perhaps minor petty offending and then go up the ladder of criminal justice and end up just in that revolving door. And so it's not a utopia, it's an objective, it's a destination. And my kind of hope is that those who engage with this argument, and perhaps the book will have some impact on that argument, will say, okay, well, we're not prepared to go all the way to your end destination, but if we can just go halfway along the road, or even, let's be honest, even a couple of centimetres will be better than where we are now. So I'm just trying to get people thinking about the whole dynamic of criminal justice, the whole ethos and the reasons behind our system in a different way.
I mean, given how disillusioned you are, how are you carrying on working in the law when you fundamentally don't believe in this system?
I think, like anyone in an imperfect system, I mean, you mentioned the response to coronavirus and the NHS and everything else. Any system is imperfect, but those who believe in the fundamental values of the system, in this case fairness and justice, when it comes to the criminal process, and I'm one of them, you have to still try to influence things from within and do your best within the constraints of what's available. And of course, it's soul destroying when you see the system working so imperfectly. And the system of criminal justice, in my view, is so badly broken that it's almost completely dysfunctional. It almost has no real objective value and purpose to our society. But nevertheless, on a case-by-case individual level, by doing our job with a degree of passion and compassion, we can make a difference on the ground in some cases. And I have had clients, for example, whose mental health problems were unrecognised for decades. And I am very acute in my kind of sensitivity around mental health, and it's something of real importance to me. And we as lawyers pick up on things like that. And I've had clients who we've successfully, through through engagement of medical services and so on, diverted away from the criminal process into the medical process. So on a case-by-case basis, you can make a difference. But one of the reasons, I guess, why I've spent time over the last couple of years making television programs and writing a book is that it gives me the freedom to try to influence the debate more widely in a way that I can't do on the ground, because on the ground I'm bound by the rules as they are now. Because my objective, Krishnan, is to be unemployed. The minute you don't need defence lawyers anymore, then you've cracked it. Because, I mean, and it's never going to happen, of course, not in my lifetime anyway. But if you can reduce the number of people coming through the system and thereby reduce the overall size of the criminal justice system to a level that's more akin to one in Norway or some of these other more progressive countries, that's a huge achievement. So I'm more than happy, maybe I've 15, 20 years to go in this job, but I'm more than happy if at the end of that process, the whole thing has shrunk down to a much smaller level.
And do you think judges are as out of touch as the cliche?
I don't. I really don't. I think most judges in the criminal courts in particular, which is my field, as you know, I think most of them have been through criminal practice first, and they have therefore seen, even if they come from wealthy backgrounds, and in fairness, the judiciary is slowly diversifying. I mean, really, very slowly. But most of them have spent time in the system, working on the ground. And I don't think that, I think they are much less out of touch in the sense of that they much less kind of depart from reality than politicians do, because politicians are just wedded to whatever gets them votes and whatever plays well on in the media and social media. Whereas judges do have to actually make decisions on a daily basis as to whether to send someone to prison or give them a chance through a rehab program or what have you. The problem is that increasingly in recent years, judges' hands have been tied in terms of sentence by sentencing guidelines. And this is the killer. If you bring in sentencing guidelines and judges are required to effectively follow these guidelines almost every time, then the room for judicial discretion and common sense, if you like, goes out the window. And that's happened year on year, time after time. You never see a sentencing guideline come out to say, use prison less or reduce everything is a ratchet effect. Everything goes up and up and up. And judges, if they do their duty according to the law, are required to follow those guidelines. So when I started out, judges had complete discretion over sentence. They could say, I'm going to take a chance on this guy. I believe that he's got a chance to kind of get off drugs or get off booze or whatever it is and make not come back to court. Now, most of the time that doesn't happen. And the guidelines are such that for many, many crimes, prison is the default solution, and judges are kind of, I would say that, having travelled a lot and been to court in many countries, I think the English judiciary, the British judiciary is as good as anywhere else. But it needs to be much more diverse because that's where it really falls down.
If the system is to change the way you would like it to, how do you think it will happen? How do you think it should happen? I mean, does it require a politician to take it up? Does it require Keir Starmer or whoever it is to say we need a massive change, or do you think it will come a different way? Could it come ground up?
I think it would have to come ground up. I'm not a politician or even a political expert. That's obviously much more your sort of area. But in terms of how you get politicians to actually do things that are radical, it really only comes from the ground up. It comes from a groundswell of public opinion saying we feel that this is wrong and actually it's failing us. And so my kind of take on that as someone who's no ambition to be a politician and has never been involved in politics, not since I was a student anyway, is that, let's use our voices. My voice, fortunately, is able to get to quite a few people and through various different channels. And I'm using my voice. And the more that people just speak up calmly but passionately and make points based on the evidence, hopefully you just start to see some, and you do need buy-in from some politicians, of course you do. You need senior politicians to have the courage of their convictions and the courage to go with the evidence. And it would be lovely to see Keir Starmer, who clearly knows a great deal about criminal justice with his background. It would be great to see him taking a more progressive view. The problem, I suspect, is that if he were to do so, and if he were to make it a real central plank of any Labour manifesto in the future, the Boris Johnsons and the Priti Patels of this world, with the much simpler kind of bashing the criminal message, I'm not sure that Keir Starmer's kind of viewpoint, if and I'm not presuming to know what it is, I'm not sure it would carry much weight with the public, and that's why I remain somewhat cynical and sceptical.
But why do you say that? I mean, because you know, as you say, it's the public ultimately who are affected by this. It's the public who feel insecure in our homes, and who can see things aren't working. Why do you think the public is more susceptible to the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade than the let's do this differently idea?
I think it goes back to the very basics of communication and marketing. And, you know, politics is as much about marketing as selling soap powder, isn't it? You have to sell your policies to the public. And the message for any successful marketing campaign has to be simple, and it has to connect with people emotionally. And the problem, as I sort of kind of pointed to earlier on, is that when you're making the argument for reform, the message is somewhat nuanced and it doesn't necessarily connect with people emotionally. So the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade have those two huge advantages in marketing terms, that they connect immediately with people's gut reactions, and therefore people instinctively, in the majority, are more in favour of a tougher, in inverted commas, approach.
So can I challenge you then to give us, what's the 30-second appeal? If you had the ad spot on telly for scrap prison and legalise drugs, what would it be?
If you want to stop wasting your taxes on things that make you more likely to be the victim of crime, more likely for your children to be killed or shot on the streets, then you need to listen carefully to these ideas. You need to think about the fact that drug prohibition causes crime, violence and misery on the streets and kills tens of thousands of people a year, including, as I point to in the book, a 15-year-old girl who died of an ecstasy overdose because it was 91% pure. In a licensed market, there would be no such substance and she'd still be alive. When you look at the statistics for care leavers, if you want people coming out of our care, to keep committing crimes and making your life and their life a misery, then leave the system as it is. But if you don't, you need to do something different with young people in the system. And as far as prisons are concerned, if you want to waste $1 billion a month of your money on making people more criminally sophisticated, then carry on as we are. But if you actually want to see prisons working and crime falling, you need to dramatically change the way that prisons are run. I don't know if I did 30 seconds, Christian, but those are the headlines.
It was pretty close. Chris, I think we must leave it there. We've only touched the surface of just a couple of issues. There's an awful lot more to talk about in criminal justice, but I think let's keep this episode focused on those two issues. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Christian.
And sharing this particular way of changing the world. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. Our producer is Rachel Evans. All of these interviews are viewable on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.